Hello and welcome everybody. Today is the first of 6 daily events in the webinar series following the launch of the University of Strathclyde's Centre for Sustainable Development, which took place yesterday afternoon. The launch and these webinars put a spotlight on some of the leading education, research, innovation and knowledge dissemination underpinned by sustainable development principles being undertaken here at the University of Strathclyde. And in particular, they explore some of the challenges and opportunities ahead as the world strives to meet the global sustainable development goals. At the launch webinar yesterday, which was recorded for those who missed it or want to listen again, we heard how this coming decade is pivotal to facilitating and delivering progress on these goals. And today's discussion focuses on Sustainable Development Goal 7, to ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable and modern energy for all, and more specifically, the future of energy production and the complexities of operating a power grid. I am Dr. Jane Roberts, a Chancellor's Fellow here in Chancellor's Fellow in Energy in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering, and the Chair for today's event. I am joined by 4 excellent colleagues, thought leaders and engaging speakers who lead in the field of energy systems and systems change, and who will be sharing their perspectives and discussing the question, can we meet people's needs for electricity without burning fossil fuels? We have 90 minutes together today, and to start, Professor Keith Bell will provide an overview of providing power and the challenges ahead. Keith will then invite our panellists, Dr. Nick Kelly, Dr. Rebecca Ford and Damien Frame to share their insights and to initiate discussion. We will then move into a more open Q&A session with you all for the final half an hour. I invite you to post questions in the question and answer function and any comments that you have in the chat as we hear from the panellists, and we'll draw from those questions and comments in the Q&A. If you wish to direct a question to a particular speaker, then please do indicate this in your question. Any question that you pose will be visible to all participants who can also vote on, and by doing so, vote up the questions that they are particularly interested in being addressed, just by pressing this little thumbs up button on the question answer panel. This way we can see which questions you feel will be most interesting for the panellists. And you're welcome to comment on each other's comments in the chat throughout the webinar too. It's a nice kind of connected community when that happens. I'll do my very best to curate and collate the breadth of the questions for the panel Q&A. And just to remind you, the webinar and the discussion is being recorded, and the recording will be available on the Centre for Sustainable Development website. So on to the webinar itself. We'll first be hearing from Professor Keith Bell. Keith holds the Scottish Power Chair in Smart Grids, is one of the co-directors for the UK Energy Research Centre, UKERC. He shares the role of Scientific Director of the Electrical Infrastructure Research Hub, and last year, Keith joined the Committee on Climate Change, which provides independent advice to UK government on building a low carbon economy and preparing for climate change. Keith, I know, is very keen to outline the challenges of electricity provision and to engage us with his perspective on the future of electricity production in a net zero world. So over to you, Keith.
Thanks very much, and hello everybody. So sorry, I get the technology to work. So yeah, this is our kind of main question for today, which hopefully we're going to address in the next sort of 50 minutes or so, with help, as Jen mentioned, from Nick, Rebecca and Damien. But to kind of get us going, I want to just get your views or your experiences. So we're going to do a little poll here, which I hope you can see on the screen. And if I push this button that says launch polling, hopefully you can see a question. When was the last time that you lost supply of electricity, either at home or at work? So how long ago was it? So if you can answer that, that would be great. It's a way of just checking we have got an audience actually, so it's good. You know, it's very difficult in these kind of remote times to see who's here. So we're getting some answers in there. Yeah, quite a few people can't remember. That's I guess not that unexpected. But also interesting, I think, that for most people who can remember, it's actually quite a long time ago since the last time that happened, and you know, I guess that's a good thing. So there's kind of, I'm going to pause it there. Now I think if I've got another question to ask, which I'm going to push the button on Now, relaunching the poll will clear the existing. Yeah, carry on. Right, so here's another. Oh no, hold on, end that. How do I go to the next one, Alan? That's the same question. End polling. Share results. Right, okay, sorry. Stop share results. How do we go to the next one? Okay, I'm going to abandon
See if
that
you go
one.
no. See if you
Hold
go
on.
to the wee arrow next to edit.
Oh, where's that then?
Right. See you got polling one. Your wee arrow. If you click that, that'll take you down to the next
Ah,
question.
I see. Right. Ah, okay. You just got to know what you're doing on this sort of thing. Here we go. Here's the new one. Right. So I'm just asking now how long it took to get your supply back again. How long did that interruption last? Okay. So it all works when the person in control knows what on earth they're doing. And it shows, yeah, mostly pretty short duration. That's good to see. One person, unfortunately, suffered quite a long outage. Quite a few people, yeah, can't remember. And yeah. Okay, so that gives us a bit of a clue. So I'm going to end that there. And I'm going to move on and ask whether any of those interruptions to supply attracted any headlines. Rather like these headlines, it's kind of, have I got power cuts for you? And there was an event that happened in August of last year, which I know my family find quite entertaining because I seem to have talked about it so much. They get well, they probably become experts in it as well. And I ended up being consulted by the media. It was kind of a new experience for me, reflecting on this event, trying to explain what had happened and what it meant. So I was quoted in various places, including the Scotsman, which my younger daughter found quite interesting. But the event that we had in Britain last year was just one of a number of major electricity outages that happened somewhere in the world. And actually every year, typically, there are, well, one or two, three, something like that. Big events, not just the sort of local ones that maybe we've experienced that we were thinking about just earlier. So there was one in Hokkaido in 2018. It disconnected 3 million people. You can see there's others from last year in Argentina, a major one there, which took out part of Uruguay. A big part of Indonesia was disconnected. The most recent one was, I think, pretty much the whole of Sri Lanka was disconnected. That was just in August this year. And the South Africa one was a little bit different, perhaps, because it arose from a long period of underinvestment in the electricity system, especially in generation capacity. And they got around to building 2 new coal-fired power stations, which have proved very unreliable. And there's all sorts of controversies there, maybe links to corruption in terms of the way those stations were built. But these other events, once something happened, once the event was triggered by some event on the network, the collapse happened extremely quickly, within minutes. And the other thing I think some of these headlines reveal is the impact on people. You can see some of the pictures there, but also the South African headline highlights the impact on the economy. The dependency on electricity specifically, but on energy more generally, I guess. And thinking about these kinds of events and comparing with what most of us, I think, in Britain have experienced or tend to experience, is a question of scale. Losses of supply due to distribution network faults are relatively common. That's probably what caused what we've experienced in the last year or two. And the priority, of course, is safe, rapid restoration. And these losses of supply to events on the transmission network are rare, but when they do happen, they can be, as we've seen from those things around the world, extremely big, essential services disrupted, and they can be very slow to recover from. So it just sort of highlights, I think, the importance of energy to the whole of society, and of electricity specifically because of its sort of physical characteristics. And there's a lot of work around different aspects of the energy system going on across the University of Strathclyde, as you can see there, to do with different technologies, environmental and social impacts, and the whole energy system transition. Okay, so I'm just going to pause a second there to invite Damien to join a bit of a discussion with me now. So Yeah, Damien, I mean, a lot of the world's population, especially on the continent of Africa, lack access to electricity. Why is it so important for them to gain access, do you think?
Well, I guess, some of your slides there, Keith, can demonstrate how big an impact even short disruptions of electricity supply can have on people's lives. So that gives some insight into life without or a complete lack of access. So in our work in the sort of Energy for Development team at Strathclyde, we use the concept of energy tiers a lot, starting with tier 1, basic access through portable solar products, then stepping up through solutions like solar home systems, reaching the top tier we call tier 5, with high quality, reliable access through grid systems, or mini grids or national grids. And so it's even a small step up in access can deliver vital improvements in livelihoods. I think that you've hinted that the correlation between the economy, economic growth, and energy access is well understood. But even the incremental steps up in energy access can yield huge returns in something called the Human Development Index, or just generally well-being. So there's huge health and environmental benefits as people move away from burning wood and charcoal and kerosene inside their homes for cooking and lighting. And yeah, I don't think the value of high quality, reliable lighting even can be understated. Recent research has shown that even with basic solar home systems, most customers report increased productivity and earning, and generally quality of life. And that's just within the home, without even starting to think about rural farming communities and the impacts that electricity access can have on water pumping for irrigation, cold storage, for food wastage, value add, and just access to markets and productivity.
Yeah. I should have said, by the way, to everyone, that Damien is a colleague of mine in the electrical engineering department at Strathclyde, where he's a research fellow, and he's done a lot of work in recent years, especially to do with local energy systems and off-grid electricity access in low-income countries. But I guess there's a contrast perhaps with some of the things we've been talking about there, and giving access to electricity with the kind of economic development in places like China, India, South Africa, that depends, so it is argued by people there and economists from the World Bank sometimes, that fossil fuels are essential to that economic growth. So what's your feeling about that?
Well, I mean, I think that's how it has occurred in those countries. I feel like they're in the same short-term position as highly developed economies with very well-established power systems. They've driven very rapid growth with coal and oil, or their initial, the development has been powered by coal and oil, and they're effectively, they're now dominated, their power systems dominated by fossil fuels, and they're dependent, essentially, I guess, on that to maintain living standards and continue to drive growth. But I think so in the same way that we are trying to transition, indeed there's a lot of leadership being shown from those countries. I think it was a recent IEA report on India commended their track record of expanding access to electricity and clean cooking for its citizens, in combination with that rapid growth and the use of wide use of coal, but they're also swiftly deploying renewable energy technologies, and they were held up as an inspiring example for many countries around the world, which I think is quite interesting. If you then look at the African continent, where the expectation is of massive growth, population growth, between today and 2040. I think the stat is something like 1 in 2 people added to global population is set to be African. And by 2025, Africa's population exceeds that both India and China. I think there's some stats like that.
Right.
So there's a massive amount of electricity access to happen and power system development to happen in that continent. So how will that happen?
So in Africa, I've seen big plans for development of hydropower in particular, and massive expansion of electricity transmission. That's using renewable energy, but of course raises some other challenges, doesn't it? So how do you think that fits with the Sustainable Development Goals?
So yeah, I guess it helps with SDG 7. So getting reliable energy access, but and yes, it's renewables, so it's not got that same immediate pollution impact as coal. But there's always trade-offs with these kind of big infrastructure projects, and I think already hydro does underpin many African countries' power systems as the main generation source, and water access, water management is a massive problem, and the various different changes in climate and rainfall patterns and effects of flooding, etc., are already impacting the existing generation, and generation outages due to those issues. So, whether hydro, I'm not sure that many of the sort of energy strategy and policies that I'm aware of, yes, they feature hydro, but they're looking elsewhere.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, what's the alternative? What else can be done that's not dependent on hydro?
Well, so I think that as I was kind of hinting at earlier, many African countries are looking at coal and oil. That's the example that's been set, and debating vigorously if that's the route that they want to go down. I don't think there's really any countries can provide an example of a highly developed electricity system that doesn't rely on large-scale generation and grid structure. So hydro will no doubt play a big part in that, and augmented by larger-scale renewables as well. But I think you're likely to get onto this. Power system dominated by renewables creates a lot of other challenges. So I think if African countries are going to avoid deploying large amounts of baseload fossil fuel generation to meet the demand growth, then the international research on how we can do that affordably needs to offer up solutions rapidly.
Yeah.
But I'm it's very encouraging to see the ambitions and the targets that are being set out in the energy strategies of African countries too.
How can we at Strathclyde, I know you've been doing a lot of work in this respect, help access to electricity, in Malawi, where I know you've been a number of times?
Yeah, certainly. Some of the work that we've been doing over the years and funded by the Scottish Government, we've been working with academic partners, NGO partners, industry partners. They are contributing to the formation of Malawi's renewable energy strategy. And Malawi as a country has got a big challenge ahead. I think only about 12% of the population will get electricity access just now. But I think the collaborative research that we can do with these partners is really important. And I think it's really interesting to think that as the growth of what decentralized renewables is happening right now, mini grids and decentralized solar across countries like Malawi, their power systems are developing almost from a bottom-up kind of view. And as we talk about decentralization and local energy systems in our country, it's a different perspective, but we're talking about similar directions of travel. So I think that kind of two-way learning and collaboration that we can undertake with these partners is going to be really important.
Okay, thanks very much. You're going to join us at the panel discussion at the end. So yeah, just remind everyone, if you've got questions to the panel or to any one of us, please put it in the Q&A and use the chat for kind of general comments. Thanks, Damien. I'm going to see if I can resume my presentation in the right way. Is this going to work if I choose that one? So can everybody see, can you see my kind of full screen as a full presentation thing there, Damien?
Yep.
Nods. Okay, so
yeah,
good.
got you, Keith. Yeah.
Cool.
Thanks.
You can't see my own kind of presenter notes and everything. I can just see the, oh great, okay, so it's working. I'll move on then. So I want to come back to the UK and think about that energy system transition and how we can reduce the dependency on fossil fuels. And I mean, this is yeah, we're very proud of the way that, I mean, quite rightly, I think, the way we've been decarbonising the electricity system over, say, the last decade. But that's just a very small part of the overall energy system. And we can see how much coal use is reduced, especially as a fuel for electricity generation. But electricity is just a small part of the overall picture. And there's a lot of petroleum and gas use still to be reduced, and big challenges in particular in heating and transport. And another view on how emissions have come down in the electricity sector, but how emissions are still very high in lots of other sectors. And one of the challenges then, I guess we were just talking about there with Damien, is to still support people's livelihoods, provide the kind of economic basis for public services and jobs and so on, and a kind of, in a sense, a decoupling of the economy from emissions. And that's something that we seem to have been able to achieve in Scotland over the last few years, but we've got to go, you know, a lot further and start tackling heat, transport, and land use. To give a bit more perspective on that challenge of especially decarbonising the use of heat, if we zoom in to the kind of daily profiles of energy use, and this, you know, the blue line is gas demand in Scotland, and the red line is electricity demand. So it's another way of seeing that, you know, the peak demand for gas is so much bigger at the moment in the winter than that for electricity. And if we end up decarbonising heating by electrifying a lot of it, what would that mean for the electricity system? Well, what if, you know, half, just to start with, half of that demand, gas demand for heat, was converted to heat pumps with a coefficient of performance of 3. You know, so, you know, we know that heat pumps, as Nick will describe to us in a little bit, you get more energy out than you put in. What would that do to the daily electricity peak? And that would be roughly 50% bigger. So, you know, we've got to build the electricity system then to accommodate that. I think most scenarios, looking ahead out to, say, 2050, for which the UK's net zero greenhouse gas emissions target has been set, are looking towards a great deal of electrification of transport and heat. Where the scenarios differ is in quite how much. But whatever the amount is, we know that the demand for electricity is going to grow, and at the same time, that has to be provided in pretty much a zero emissions manner. Okay, so I'm just going to introduce another colleague from the Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering Department, Nick Kelly, who's a reader there, and he's been working on energy use in buildings for, well, some years now, since the 90s. It's good to have the sun in Scotland, but I'm just getting blinded slightly there. So Nick, so you're in the Energy Systems Research Unit, where you do a lot of work on modelling of buildings. Why is that important?
Keith, we're primarily concerned with assessing the overall performance of buildings. So it's not just energy. So yes, it's energy usage, but it's what you end up doing with the energy. So we're also interested in the sort of quality of the indoor environment that you generate. So we can do that virtually using modelling. So we use that to assess the performance of existing and also proposed building designs. So if a building doesn't exist, you can't measure what's going on. But we also do quite a lot of monitoring of buildings and technologies to see how they actually perform, and that allows us to verify our models. It's important that we do this, that we look at this, because we spend about 90% of our time indoors. So the quality of that indoor environment has a big impact on our health and well-being. And more importantly, for this kind of webinar in colder climates like the UK, there's about 40 to 50% of delivered energy is accounted for by the built environment. So tackling that energy consumption from buildings and trying to decarbonise it is critical to that decarbonisation effort moving forward to 2045, 2050.
And what would you say are the main challenges then in terms of the heat source? You mentioned, you know, of course, we've got to think about the whole performance of a building and its insulation and so on. So the main source of low carbon heat.
Yeah, so I mean, decarbonisation of heat, I mean, there's kind of two issues wrapped up in that. So the first one is switching fuel supplies to some kind of decarbonised alternative to what we've got at the moment, which is predominantly gas for heat. But we also need to tackle the fairly poor energy performance of the UK building stock as well. So that allows you to make that problem of fuel substitution a little bit more tractable. So, I mean, I kind of jotted down what I thought the key challenges are. So the first one is basically time. So we've got this mid-century target of decarbonisation. We've got about 29 million households in the UK. So this is just talking about the domestic sector. And effectively, let's be generous and say we've got about 20 million households to try and decarbonise by say 2050. So we need to try and improve their overall energy performance and swap them to some form of zero carbon heating system. So what that means, you get about 600, 700,000 households to do a year. So that means you get a retrofit completion to do every 47 seconds starting now. So time, actually getting things done in time for 2050 is going to be exceptionally difficult to.
So why are any of us still here in this webinar? We should be just going out and getting on with it. 47 seconds have passed and another household hasn't yet been done.
I think the key thing to take away from this webinar, Keith, will be to invest in scaffolding. Yeah, so for all these retrofits. I guess the other one is cost. So actually, how do you go about funding all of the fuel substitutions and energy efficiency improvements? So who's going to pay for that? So we'll come to heat pumps a little bit later on, but a heat pump will cost 5 times more than a gas boiler. So where's the incentive to invest in that? And if you add on things like having to put external and internal insulation in your building, that adds thousands more onto that cost. So who's going to pay for it? Is it in the private sector? Is it the householder? Is the householder going to be expected to raise all that capital? If not, where does that come from?
Yeah, so I mean, we've mentioned heat pumps quite a bit there. So how feasible is that? What does that depend on? What are the different sources of heat that they can make use of?
Yeah, so I mean, guess what we're talking about is we've got millions of gas boilers in the UK servicing about 80% of domestic heating. So if we want to have any hope of having a zero carbon heating, we've got to get rid of all of those and swap them out with something. So we'll get three main types of heat pumps. So we'll get ground source, water source, and an air source. And effectively, all a heat pump is doing is it's taking heat from a low temperature reservoir and basically upping its quality a little bit by consuming electricity and pushing it to a higher temperature. So that's basically what we're doing. But there's issues with each of those types of heat pumps, so ground, water, and air. So for ground and water, there's a very limited number of buildings in which you could actually integrate those technologies. Ground source heat pump, you need access to a bit of land to act as your heat reservoir, and ditto for water source. So in urban areas where we've got a lot of crowding, there's not necessarily people with gardens and land, that's not really an option. So looking at the sort of mass replacement of boilers, you're really talking about air source heat pumps, and air source heat pumps don't have as good it's called a seasonal performance factor. So that's the amount of heat you can shift to the amount of electricity that you consume. And the poorer your seasonal performance factor is, then obviously the bigger the impact on the grid is going to be. So you go back to your slide a couple of minutes ago. So if you swap that heat load to the electricity sector, then the better the heat pump performance, then the bigger or the lesser that hit's going to be. So if you get poorer quality heat pumps, then the impact on the electricity network is going to be greater. The other thing to point out is that heat pumps are not a direct replacement for gas boilers. They don't quite operate in the same way. So firstly, they don't deliver the same temperatures as gas boilers do. So a good heat pump will give you about 50 degrees C water temperature output. Gas boilers giving you to between 80 to 90 degrees C. So that means you need to sort of rethink your heat emitters that you got inside buildings. So that's either you need to resize your radiators and put new radiators in, which again adds to the cost, or you need to think about improving the quality of insulation in the building so that you can maintain the same quality, the same comfort in the indoor environment.
Yeah, so then is there an alternative to heat pumps?
Well, so now we come to the other issues. So I guess if you're being idealistic, you could think about just using solar heat. So you could use solar energy, and we get far more solar energy on the Earth's surface than we actually ever use. The problem we've got in places like Scotland, unusually looking outside the window today, the sun's beaming in, but as we all know, that's not necessarily the case. The seasonal or solar energy is exceptionally seasonal. So if you're going to use solar heat to meet all your heating needs, you need to think about some mechanism for storing it. You know, the normal mode of doing that is to use a reversible heat pump, push heat into the ground when you've got a surplus of solar, and then take it back out in the winter. But again, you're back to the same problem with ground source heat pumps. Not all buildings are suitable for that type of heat exchange, and again, it's a huge cost. The other one would be passive heat. So there's quite a few houses in Scandinavia where you don't have any heating at all. Instead, what happens is they're so well insulated, you just make use of the heat coming off of individuals and equipment inside buildings, and that's enough to meet your heat demands. Requires exceptional levels of insulation and good ventilation strategies as well to avoid things like summer overheating. Yeah, I mean, more realistically, I'm afraid you're starting to look at things like direct electric, which is perhaps viable in the future, but only in buildings with low enough heating demands. So if you rolled out direct electric, which is cheap at the large scale, then you're basically creating a gigantic problem for yourself in terms of the energy network. And then beyond that, you're really looking at something like hydrogen as another energy vector. So there's different ways in which you could do that. You could maybe pipe hydrogen into homes and convert boilers to burn hydrogen. There's big technical and potentially safety issues associated with that. And the other alternative is to move towards something like domestic fuel cells, which were a kind of hot topic maybe 15 years ago, but their exorbitant costs basically meant that it was never really a sort of viable proposition, and it still isn't. So you do have a kind of limited number of alternatives to heat pumps, and again, all of them have their problems.
Okay, excellent. Well, thanks very much, Nick, and we'll invite you back to join the panel discussion. I'll just remind everyone that we've got the Q&A. So if you've got a question or a point that you'd like the panel to discuss or like us collectively to come back to in the last kind of half an hour of the webinar, please put your point or your question on the Q&A. So if you've already put some comments that you'd like us to discuss on the chat, please copy them across into the Q&A. That would be great. Okay, so now I need to kind of push some buttons to resume my little presentation. So hopefully I'm on the right places and someone will tell me if I'm not. So what we've kind of, the upshot of that, I think, that discussion with Nick, certainly for the UK, and we're looking at getting rid of our natural gas boilers and replacing them pretty much with electric heat pumps. You know, that's going to increase the electricity demand, the total energy used, and it's going to increase the peak as well. So it means we need a lot of new generation capacity, from just a bit more than 100 gigawatts now up to, well, here's some of the recent scenarios published by National Grid, looking at somewhere between sort of 220 and 320 gigawatts of capacity. So it's a lot to be added, maybe, tripling the size of the electricity system in the next 30 years. But that kind of peak figure, that the amount of capacity on the network and of generation capacity would be a lot more without flexibility. So to what extent can we move demand around to avoid kind of everyone demanding electricity all at exactly the same time? So if we're going to do this with renewables, of course, that's a great resource that's available to us, and we've been doing this a lot. But as Damien kind of hinted at, there are issues around the operation of a power system with renewables, and we've got to address that. We've got to tackle this head on. It's a controversial thing. You can see some of the headlines there. There was a big electricity interruption in South Australia in September 2016. Various people who were opposed to renewable energy and opposed in particular to wind farms jumped on it, claiming that this was the cause. Similar thing maybe in what happened here in Britain last year, although a certain Scots professor was arguing that it wasn't, and if we've got time I can explain why. But we've certainly got to address it, and I'm pleased to see that the electricity system operator has recognised this challenge, the need to run a zero carbon power system, and they've set a target for themselves of 2025. And in spite of the date in which that headline came out, that's not a joke. This is deadly serious. But as I implied earlier, when we're kind of reflecting on some of these events that have happened around the world, the power system has got to be managed carefully. It's a dynamic, non-linear system. It's very sensitive, unlike maybe heat systems or gas systems where there's a bit of kind of room for maneuver because of some inherent storage. Electricity systems, when they go wrong, can go wrong extremely quickly. I mean, within seconds, things can cascade to a complete collapse. And in a way, it's a kind of amazing that we haven't had more of these disturbances than we have. But that's kind of down to custom and practice that's been accumulated over decades that is now being challenged by the different kind of technology that we're getting on the system. Fundamentally, it starts with one of balance, balancing generation and demand. And we can do that over time. So if we can, start up generation to meet the demand as it rises, and then we can shut it down again, that's the way we've been doing it for decades. But if we can shift some of the demand around to fit the available low carbon generation, then that ought to be more cost effective. We could use storage to do this. And actually, we've been using storage for years and years. The ability to store fossil fuels and then convert the energy in them into electricity at the right time is what's enabled us to do this balancing across time. But when we shut down all these fossil fuel power stations, we're going to lose all that storage capacity. So as I said, the nature of generation is changing to something that's highly variable, weather dependent. The technology itself is changing, which then leads to different characteristics for the system in terms of its dynamic performance. And a lot of the generation is small scale and connected to the distribution networks. And it's, not got the same sort of management, visibility, monitoring and control infrastructure that transmission connected big stuff has. So we've got to be able to flex, as we have done. We've got to be able to do it in a different way. But if we're going to have electric vehicles and electrified heat, that gives us some potential to move demand for electricity around in time. Will we be able to shift it far enough to reduce the size of that peak, which then sets the size of the network and of the generation capacity? Bit of a challenge, I think, particularly in the mornings of a cold morning. Will we get enough diversity in the morning heat demand to kind of mean that the kind of instantaneous peak can be made smaller, to, as I say, reduce the amount of infrastructure that we need to provide? There's actually another challenge that we might not have thought of, which is times when there's almost too much low carbon power. Will there be enough demand to be able to use it? Because the balance of generation and demand goes both ways. And actually, we've seen this over the spring and the summer this year during the pandemic-related lockdown, where actually the electricity system operator took some slightly panicky steps to try to get greater control, to be able to switch off some low carbon generation, actually placed a contract with EDF Energy to reduce the output of Sizewell B nuclear power station by 50% through the duration of the summer. I mentioned EVs, so this gives us some potential for charging. If all the vehicles on the road are converted to being electric, if the driving patterns are the same as they are now, which they might not be. We might move more towards kind of car clubs and kind of Uber style taxi services, which means that they're on the road a lot more. But at the moment, on average, only 4% of cars are on the road at any one time. So when they're parked and plugged in, we've got a great deal of choice about when we do the charging. So we could fit that towards when it's windy and sunny. Although we also have to keep in mind how long the cars are parked for. So you can see some of the data there that was produced by one of the researchers in the group at Strathclyde, James. And this fluctuation also needs to be managed. We need generation resources that can ramp up and then ramp down quickly enough. And the thermal plant that historically has done that and might still do it in future, albeit either having to try and capture the carbon emissions, gives quite a sort of chemical engineering challenge there, or perhaps by burning low carbon hydrogen. There are kind of thermal challenges around the kind of stresses of starting up and shutting down generation. There's also this challenge of the fact that, it's not windy all the time, and especially what we might call wind drought, so extended periods of time when this major source of renewable electricity isn't available to us. And here's an example from a couple of years ago, where for more than a month, throughout that period, the capacity factor, the proportion of energy that can come from a wind farm was very small relative to the annual average. So we've got to have some kind of other resource that can fill in the gap during these sort of wind droughts. Another way in which we can try to manage the electricity system and the imbalance is about balancing out in space. So we can pool the resources, if you like, across a large area. Sometime, at one particular time, there might be a surplus in one area that can balance out a deficit in another. It allows you to pool resources and actually also to exploit economies of scale. But that balancing out in space depends on network capacity. And there's a whole bunch of other things to do with the engineering of an electricity system, of a power system. And a lot of the services to allow us to get the engineering right has been provided by fossil fueled plant. So again, what happens when it goes? Now, another challenge is represented by the kind of complex set of relationships in a liberalized sector, such as we have here. Electricity industry around the world, many places has been opened up to competition, and because you want competition, you would then have different entities that are acting in different sectors. Maybe you have the networks are still regarded as a monopoly. There's a regulatory arrangement sitting around that. So you've got a complex set of relationships. So here we've got generators and consumers. This is a chart, by the way, that Damien produced a few years ago. Well, he did most of it. We still haven't got around to publishing. Damien, we must get around to that sometime soon. So we can see the network owners, the generators, large consumers. There's also a supplier, which is kind of agent that all of us buy energy from. They act on our behalf in the wholesale market. There's a system operator, so National Grid, in our case in Britain, that looks after the transmission system and looks after that system balancing. There's another entity called an aggregator, which can kind of pool some different flexibility resources together. Another company called Elexon, which sorts out the bills pretty much in the wholesale market. And then it's the controls that the system operator exercises to get that balancing right, and also to a certain extent in the distribution networks. And then you've got all the commercial relationships among all these different parties. So, I mean, the point is that it's pretty complicated, and yet we've got to meet all these new kind of technical challenges. One of the ways in which people have talked about doing this, especially when we want much more active participation, exercises flexibility from small consumers, small generators, allow them to take part in the market, is maybe we can do all this through a distribution system operator that acts as a kind of standard intermediary for all of the smaller scale players. But there are some pros and cons in that, and there are other models that have been proposed as well. Alternatively, we could allow kind of a more distributed decision making, but can we be sure that that would respect the network limits and make sure that the whole system remains stable and we avoid those kinds of big blackouts that I mentioned earlier? Okay, so at this point, I'm going to ask Dr. Rebecca Ford to join in the discussion. So she's unusual in that she sits in two different departments. Department of Politics and in Electrical and Electronic Engineering. She's a Chancellor's Fellow in Energy and the Research Director of a big research consortium called EnergyRev, and also, very excitingly, was recently appointed as one of the UK's 4 COP26 Fellows. Okay, so I'm glad to see that Rebecca is there, ready. So, we can see that these big changes are needed in the way we engage with energy across society, businesses, public bodies, individuals. In what ways are these changes happening? And how these different organizations are thinking about the way we use energy?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think, as you've already said, this shift to renewables is leading to decentralization, but it's not just in terms of those physical assets, it's also in operation. You just highlighted around the kind of DNO, DSO transition. Ownership structures are changing, business models, sometimes seeing more local value, governance structures and so on. And in the UK, we're starting to see an emergence of more and more local solutions. So smart local energy systems is something we're looking at in EnergyRev. And these often involve local authorities, community groups, sometimes local businesses, or at least business models looking at delivering value back into that locality or region, looking at kind of the context-specific needs. And we're also seeing end users take up new roles. So a shift away from thinking about just kind of passive customers to active citizens that can participate in a whole lot of different ways, whether that's being engaged citizens, members of community energy groups, through adopting new technologies such as electric vehicles or new forms of heating, and potentially even through demand side management measures to help control the grid. So we are starting to see a change, certainly in the UK, around how people are participating in the energy system across kind of all walks of society.
Yeah, but I mean, can we leave the system and the way it kind of all hangs together entirely to choices made on the demand side?
No, I don't think we can. So I think what's exciting is starting to see the opportunity for the demand side to engage in new ways. But I actually think it's kind of hard to think about the supply side and the demand side, because I think what's happening with this, this kind of evolution of these more local energy systems is that that's starting to blur. And so it's starting to become a more complex system where supply and demand is interactive. But we heard from Nick earlier about how fast we need to move, and that needs really strong leadership from government. So beyond just setting those targets, we need to have clear strategies for how we're going to meet those targets. And that might be things around, you know, are we looking to grow heat pumps? Are we looking at district heating schemes, repurposing of the gas network? Now, local regions and in those smart local energy systems might be really nice vehicles for delivering these strategies, where they can be delivered in an engaged way with people across that community. But that can't happen from the grass up alone. We need clear frameworks to enable household action and indeed regional action to be embedded within those national strategies.
And are different sort of some of these different actors, do some of them exist now? Are they starting to emerge, or would you see some of the existing main players in the sector starting to take on new kinds of roles? How do you think that might kind of play out?
Yeah, no, it's really interesting, and certainly within Energy Rev and looking at some of these emerging smart local energy system demonstrators that we're seeing, some of them do involve very traditional actors that are interacting in new ways, really recognizing that the system has to change. And I was reflecting on this because even 5 years ago, I don't think we would be seeing it from that lens. I think a lot has changed in recent years, and traditional actors really are seeing a new way of doing things and new opportunities. But we are also seeing a lot of new businesses come to the fore, offering new services and engaging people in new ways. So I think it's quite a mix. I do think that one kind of interesting observation is around the different sorts of outcomes that different stakeholders in the system are looking to deliver. So often when talking to people about what this energy system transition is going to lead to, they talk about a number of different key outcomes. So alongside reaching net zero, people might also talk about opportunities for regional development. Certainly with COVID, this idea of aligning post-pandemic economic growth with green outcomes, but also things like more fundamental, like operational costs of the system and energy costs passed on to end users, other environmental benefits beyond net zero, as well as the kind of broader levelling up agenda and social justice aspects. So I think that what we're seeing is these kind of a range of different outcomes that we're trying to deliver, but also a range of different contexts and therefore different stakeholders in those contexts in which they're being delivered. And these contexts vary dramatically in terms of how rich they are in resources, their institutional capacity, so how engaged and resourced their local authority might be, what their heritage looks like. So yeah, are they old mining towns? Are we talking about rural areas? Are we talking about inner cities? It's very, very different context. And even the social structure.
That could end up with quite different approaches being adopted, and we somehow need to accommodate that, you think?
Absolutely. So very different approaches, very different abilities to engage in different ways.
So do you think our kind of regulatory and commercial structures that we have at the moment can accommodate that kind of diversity of different approaches or new actors or new roles? Or do we need to, or are there some key changes that you think we need to make?
Yeah, I definitely think there need to be some changes there. So, so I'll give a specific example. So some work that my colleagues in Energy Rev led, so Jan Webb and Mags Tingey at the University of Edinburgh, they've recently published some work looking at local authorities and their role in driving net zero localities. And so local authorities have a huge amount of ambition, and we see that with all these kind of net zero targets being set at local levels that are far more ambitious than our national targets. But they have a number of challenges. So this report looks at some things like the lack of resource, so carbon and energy and non-statutory obligations, which means that they are fighting for resource against other things that are more kind of, you know, that they're obliged to deliver on. But also even more basic challenges around procurement rules and the recognition of the carbon embedded within that, and embedding carbon into decision-making frameworks as well as cost. And so this idea of how do we value outcomes beyond those traditional outcomes, I think is absolutely critical to embed into those frameworks. But again, I think it's also about, you know, going beyond just thinking about embedding different outcomes into those frameworks. How do we think about alignment across scales? So we need that strong leadership, we need strategies, not just targets, but we also need to have the governance structures that allow those strategies to be delivered in context-specific ways. We need to start investing in that future now, because if we're going to get to the rates of deployment that we heard about earlier, we have to build up the skills and the capacity and the industries to deliver them, and that needs to start today.
Okay, yes, so you're issuing a lot of challenges to all of us there. Thank you very much, Becky. We'll welcome you back for the discussion. I'll just remind everyone that we've got the Q&A, so you want to make some points for the panel to discuss. At the end, please do put them in there. I'm going to kind of, again, try and push the right buttons to resume where I'd got to. Okay, so there we are. So, I mean, one of the things Becky mentioned just at the end there was about different scales. And a lot of what Energy Rev is about is kind of the local and relatively small scale. One of the things I kind of wonder about with the local authorities that do set these ambitious net zero targets, which I think is great, by the way, is do they fully understand where the low carbon energy is going to come from? And I think there's still going to be a big role to be played by large scale stuff because of the economies of scale that can come with it, and also because of the acceptability of different kinds of resources. We've seen some of the kind of challenges around getting planning permission for onshore wind, and that's one of the things that's driven the development of wind offshore. But offshore, that's also allowed the economies of scale. The turbines are so much bigger. And that's one of the reasons why the costs have come down so dramatically. So we don't have to talk about low carbon energy being very expensive, just in terms of its production and production of each megawatt hour anymore, although we do have to think about the whole system cost. Now we have this ambition was set in the Conservative Party manifesto from the election in December of having 40 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity in British waters by 2030. So that's an enormous amount. How are we going to accommodate that? So for me as a power systems engineer, I'm interested as well in how we get the networks there to bring that power back to shore. As it happens, this is something that we looked at back in 2010 to 2012 in a European project. We did quite a lot of modeling of networks in the North Sea in particular. And I was looking at this the other day, and by coincidence, the scenario that we defined in 2010 for 2030 had 40 gigawatts of offshore wind in British waters. So yes, okay, we've already got some kind of studies there to look at that we need to maybe refresh in terms of the more up-to-date costs. And there's a whole raft of work I'm pleased to sort of say that many colleagues at Strathclyde are involved with to do with wind energy, wind turbine design, control of turbines, control of wind farms, grid integration, reliability of turbines and the electrical infrastructure. And we're part of an electrical infrastructure research hub with the Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult, for example, that's picking up a lot of these sorts of issues. Now, we've touched on hydrogen once or twice in this webinar already, and I mean, it has a lot of attractions. What I'm calling here is a kind of universal flexibility variable, and it gives you this flexibility both in time and in space. You can imagine a hydrogen network that can move energy around. You've got a wind farm that's maybe producing lots of energy at a particular time when it's not all needed. If you've got an electrolyzer, you can turn it into hydrogen, you can store it, and you can move it around somewhere else. Potentially, if it's not windy, you could take that hydrogen and burn it in a combined cycle gas turbine to make electricity again. So it looks really promising, but the costs are very high. And how are we going to transition to it? This hydrogen has to be low carbon. We could make it using methane reformation, but we've got to capture the CO2 from that. So there's a dependency on CCS as well. But it does give us options for moving the energy around. There's a North Sea wind power hub idea that's been put forward by the Dutch electricity system operator, where instead of having lots and lots of cables coming to shore, you could have a few pipes bringing the same amount of energy. The electricity system and how all that fits together, we need to get the right kind of flexibility, I think. Wind, if it's windy, can contribute, helping to balance things out in very short timescales, actually. And a really useful thing that's been developed by, again, colleagues here, Jethro Browell and Adam Stock in particular, is the power available signal. Get a measurement, goes through to the system operator. They can tell what needs to be done in order to kind of regulate the whole system. There's this question, I think, of whether we can rely on the energy markets to deliver the right kind of capability to fill in all these gaps. And we have a capacity market at the moment that is designed to ensure security of supply at time of the peak demand, but it doesn't look very carefully. It's not very specific about what kind of capacity and whether those sources of power can be sustained for minutes, hours, or days through wind droughts. And it doesn't look either at the locations relative to the network capacity. So I'm tending to think now that we need the right mix of flexibility, what I'm calling schedulability, its ability to plan output and choose it over a number of days into the future. And persistence, that an output can be sustained with, you can be confident, so it can fill in some of these droughts. To give you an example of how some of the kind of sources of flexibility or of low carbon power look in those three dimensions, we can see that nothing's perfect, nothing does all of it. So I think it's a challenge to get the right kind of mix. And who are going to be the key actors in delivering all of this? So, and then there's everything else that I kind of just skated over very briefly in passing that we need for system operability. A whole list of things there, which I'm not going to go through now, but I will highlight one thing in particular, which is power electronics, which are becoming much more ubiquitous on the system. A lot of our appliances, laptops and so on, and TVs use power electronic interfaces to the network, and there are lots of sources of generation. Wind turbines, solar PV use power electronics, and so do the high voltage DC interconnectors with the rest of Europe. So these offer a huge amount of potential for very rapid, very flexible control. Unfortunately, they also offer, I think, some threats of unintended interactions with each other largely, and it was shown back in August of last year by some oscillations that came up at a wind farm in Hornsey, which then led to it tripping, which helped that big incident kind of propagate. However, I'm pleased to say that, again, colleagues here at Strathclyde, I think, are home to arguably the UK's leading research group concerned with power electronics on a power system. Okay, so to come back to that question where I started, or actually a modified version of it, can we meet the people's needs for energy without unabated burning of fossil fuels? We could still use fossil fuels, provided we capture the carbon emissions. That gives us some of that schedulability, perhaps, that I mentioned. I would say the answer to this is yes, but it depends on a whole bunch of things. We need to tackle all these challenges, and we need to make sure that the energy system as a whole fits within the wider context of what's right for society, land use, the environment, and so on. I think our job as engineers, I'm an engineer, in a sense, is to prove that there's no reason not to make this energy system transition through to one that has no emissions, and possibly even negative emissions if it's integrated with bioenergy and carbon capture and storage. I think, yes, we've got these major challenges. We've got to bring people with us, that engagement piece that Becky was talking about. And, operating the system is not, with high penetration of renewables, is not trivial. We want to avoid the kind of situation that we had in August last year, where the lights went out, for example, in the underpass at a station. Engineers are very conservative. We worry about avoiding bad things, want to be very cautious in the way we move forward. But actually, I believe that the best are also highly creative. Our role is critical to the future. We have to have the imagination to see the future, to be willing to embrace it, and the expertise, proper, deep expertise to make it work, so that we can see a future clear of urban pollution and making use of low carbon energy. Okay, so at this point, I think we can invite the panel back in, and Jane is going to look after this bit of proceedings. So yeah, just remind everyone, please put your questions and comments for the panel on the Q&A.
Yeah, so please do. Please enter the questions, discussion points that you have into that Q&A. Please also, if you can, if you do the little thumbs up next to the questions that have been submitted, then you can help us to prioritise and rank which questions you think are particularly interesting for the panel to tackle. So I'm wondering, there's a few ways that we can approach this. I can read out some of the questions directly, or I can try and synthesize them. And I think just to start with, I might, one of the themes of the questions that have been coming in is this difference between rural and challenges in rural environments and city environments. And another question theme has been about costs and actually supporting the low carbon energy market, particularly where costs are falling. So I might start with that question and then move on to the next. So several questions are asking about the cost in supporting the low carbon energy market, particularly where the costs are falling, like we've seen for offshore wind. So what sort of things do you see as the key challenges in supporting that low carbon energy market into the future?
I've accidentally left my microphone on, so maybe I'll start off and let others come in. I think it's really important that that cost is minimised. Actually, you know, the cost is going to be picked up by somebody. In the end, it's picked up either by consumers, by energy users, or by taxpayers, depending on what the kind of cost recovery model is. Giving some confidence to investors, I think, is really important. Then also in minimising the cost. You know, the kind of cost of capital is heavily influenced by how much confidence you can have that you're going to recover your investment. And we've had mechanisms such as you know, auction for contracts for difference for low carbon energy that I think have been very successful in this country. I mean, some of the early stuff, we've still got that legacy cost. You know, things weren't always quite so cheap, but having developed that market, that's helped the cost to come down. So that's an extremely good thing. How much each individual consumer should pay, I think, is a very kind of sensitive issue. I think, you know, an incentive to be efficient in your use of energy, I think, is really important, and that applies especially for industrial and commercial users. But the ability to pay, and whether, you know, some of the cost of the transition, which is a cost, how that bill is split among different users, I think that's a sort of bigger policy question. And back to this one about, well, you know, what cost is recovered via taxpayers, and what's costs are recovered via energy users.
Any other panelists like to reflect? Becky?
Yeah, I'll just add to the point that Keith was saying about investment and getting stronger investment. And I think particularly when we've been looking at more localized energy solutions, there's still a very big question about what are you actually asking people to invest in. Is it a kind of whole system solution? Is it bits of the system? What is it that we're trying to think about replicating or scaling up and growing? So for me, there's an open question about what it is we're trying to get investment in. But I do think that without these longer term strategies and a much clearer direction of travel, it is very hard. There's still a lot of uncertainty, and that's absolutely critical.
Yeah. Thanks, Keith and Becky. Oh, Keith?
I'll add, you know, kind of, you know, there's a lot of costs then. I mean, Nick touched on this, you know, back to, I mean, I kind of touched on the supply side, you know, in low carbon production of energy, but there's big questions I think that Nick touched on the demand side of, you know, low carbon, or giving yourself the ability to use low carbon sources of energy. I mean, we've seen the government has recently announced some grants. I don't know whether they kind of go far enough to really make the difference, Nick.
I mean, I think the grant is about, what, £5,000. So if you were wanting to get a decent heat pump installation, for example, in your house, that's the grant more than gone, and you've probably got about another couple of £1,000 to foot on top of that. And then typically you would probably have to implement some kind of energy efficiency solutions in your house as well, just to ensure that the heat coming from the heat pump was sufficient to meet your needs. So, you know, it's really problematic. So I think, you know, from the point of view of the average university professor, that transition isn't going to be a problem, because you'll have loads of capital sitting about in your house, Keith, you know, and you can afford these low carbon solutions. But for the, you know, the bog standard lecturer, you know, it's a problem, and we've seen that repeated previously. I mean, we saw it with FITS. So FITS, you know, there was no problem with regards to getting investment if there was a sufficient incentive. The only problem is the people who benefited from that investment were those who had the capital to invest in things like photovoltaics, and we had a chunk of the population who were left behind and who didn't have the capital to invest and benefit from the system. So it needs a lot of thought with regards to how we incentivize and fund, you know, from the end user's point of view. How do we provide them with the capital to improve their energy efficiency and switch over to these low carbon heat sources?
Yeah, and I'll just add to that as well. And I think it's more than just the financial ability to do it as well, because what you're asking people to do is basically to become expert decision makers. I've just moved into a new house. I've got absolutely no idea where to start, and I work in this field. And I think that it needs to also be a focus on how do you deliver it as well. So obviously I completely agree with all the points that you make, but it is a whole range of challenges on the, I guess, more social side of delivering these schemes.
Great. I think that links really nicely into a question that was raised in the Q&A as well by Anya Lowett around actually how do you incentivise, maybe from a policy perspective, incentivise these retrofit measures in your homes from a consumer perspective. And I'm going to combine that question with one raised by Roddy Yar as well around the complexity of the solutions for communities and individuals. As Becky said, she's just moved into a house, doesn't know where to start. Others might be familiar with that feeling as well. I certainly am too. And so using the experiences of smart meters, Roddy suggests as an example, I wonder if we can reflect on how do we bring about that change that's needed at this scale down from the individuals up to the policy, and that's for all panelists.
Well, I think the access to the expertise is a really important thing. You know, I mean, who would you go to first of all if you've you know, got the opportunity to change your heating system? Well, got the opportunity with another way of saying your gas boiler's given up and it's suddenly turned cold. You've got to do something. Who do you turn to? You might turn to, you know, your plumber or your regular gas fitter, which I did about this time last year, and they said, well, heat pumps, don't know anything about that. You know, what are you going to do? So getting the kind of skills and expertise out there, I think, is really important. So one part of it is, I think, you know, it's a bit of a kind of Cinderella is forgotten about. The FE colleges, I think, are really important in this. I've been listening to a couple of things recently about you know, the foundational economy and you know, valuing better different types of skills and expertise in the economy. I think that makes the point very, very vividly. You know, that we've got to encourage people to pick up these sorts of skills, give them the opportunity to do so. The courses have got to be there. They've got to be accredited. We've got to give confidence. But the individuals, if you're going to take time out to go and study to pick up some of this stuff, you've got to have confidence that there's a job for you, that it's really worthwhile investing your time and effort into this. So the things have got to come together, the policies to kind of give the incentives on the buyers of this new services and equipment at the same time as the people who can deliver it. And we've got to have confidence that they can deliver it. No one's going to add anything to that. I was kind of hoping someone would come in and.
I'll add something, Keith. Yeah, you made me think there with some of your comments on the skills and expertise. I mean, as you mentioned in my intros, I mainly work in Malawi and, you know, sub-Saharan African countries, but you know, the adoption and the enabling energy access depends on having, you know, organisations with the right skills on the ground, local organisations that can offer the right kind of solutions. You know, it's like there's plenty of solutions to be sold, and there's plenty of companies that want to sell solutions to enable energy access, but having the right skills on the ground and organisations with understanding of the right business models for them to operate these assets. If we're talking about decentralised renewables and mini grids playing a massive part of energy access, then, you know, who is it that's going to run those assets with and offer tariffs that are affordable to these very poor communities? So those things need to happen, and we talk about the role of FITs here and subsidy and support. So how do you feed those kind of support mechanisms into enabling that kind of slightly boosting the ability to pay that kind of kicks off that kind of, you know, that allows that kind of investment to happen, because there's, you know, creating a business model for people to invest into deploying decentralized assets in a sub-Saharan African country without the prospect of feeding into the grid or some sort of feed-in tariff is a pretty massive challenge. But also, I think there was a question about smart meters and also, you know, the kind of the technology side of things. So that has been a huge boost and an enabler to the rollout of solutions, you know, decentralized renewable solutions, as the advent of mobile money and pay-as-you-go metering. So as there's a kind of a balance between complexity, there needs to be sufficient, you know, technical complexity to then offer a simple service and solution to customers that create that business model. So some of those things are happening now and are really accelerating and delivering a lot of improvement.
I think there's this bit about engagement and bringing people with you is really important. I think the question was asked about smart meters and the suggestion that the rollout has not gone very well. And it's partly, I think, because it's been so piecemeal. I think it's partly because nobody understands why you're doing it. I think it's been oversold. I mean, for me, the benefit is it's automated meter reading. That's it, actually. There is a benefit in that because it ought to make it easy to switch supplier and to be able to then in turn access various other smart things. It's an enabler. It's not smart in itself. But if it had been done in a more systematic way, kind of go down the street, do it all at the same time, just get in there, do it cheaply, quickly, efficiently, get out, move on to the next place. Again, people might have more confidence in it. And I was interested in one of the outcomes from the Climate Assembly that the UK Parliament committees convened and reported back just a couple of weeks ago. They were thinking about, the kind of the heat transformation. And they were keen on it. They recognised that it's got to happen. They were keen for local people to be engaged in that decision making about what kind of approach would be used. As Becky was saying earlier, it depends on the particular, geography and the context. But then, having made that decision in a kind of, accountable, democratically accountable way, wanted to see it done in a kind of efficient, well-organised manner.
Yeah, and sorry, I was so slow to come in before because I was really reflecting on what Keith had said and forgot that I was a panelist. But I want to pick up on that because I think trust is a huge aspect of this, and I think that that's what we can learn from the smart meter deployment, and certainly in areas where it didn't go as well as it could, was that trust was a very large issue, not necessarily lessons just from the UK but from overseas as well. And so particularly if you are trying to do something to someone's home. So obviously we've been talking about home households and adopting new technologies, but not everybody is a homeowner. Not everybody is doing this for themselves. A huge number of people are living in rented accommodation or social housing. And so for me, there's a big question in there of how are you engaging people? How are you bringing them on if it's not their decision? Who's the decision maker, and how are you bringing kind of the rest of the community with you? And I think this idea of really engaging with people, building trust, even if then they're not the actual kind of ultimate decision maker or implementer, is really important.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think that actually you have indirectly answered some of the questions in here about how to incentivize or mobilize some of these communities. We've got some reflections. Paul's Jarman's saying it might be cynical that perhaps only legislation or incentives are the things that work, but from your reflections it sounds like that your perspectives would say that you don't agree with the fact that actually only incentives and legislation make things work. It's also about mobilising these structures too.
Basically making it as easy as possible. I mean, I know Paul, he's an engineer, so he's bound to be cynical, but most of us are, I think.
Brilliant. So I'm going to...
And recognising that people value... Sorry, I was just going to add to that. I'm recognising that people value a whole lot of different things. And so it might not just be about the kind of the financial aspect, but people might be quite willing and wanting to engage in something for other reasons. And I constantly hear this argument for local energy being all about, oh, we could make it cheaper. But actually, what if it didn't make it cheaper, but ticked off huge numbers of other values that people hold true? So I think we need to recognise that it's not always about the money. The finances could be a massive barrier to action, but may not be what incentivises people to take action.
Fantastic. So that I'm going to move on to one of the prioritised questions in the Q&A, because what I've been doing is just curating the questions and trying to weave them in, because your discussion is just fascinating. I'm going to specifically, the most voted question through this democratic process is by Finn Christie, that the UK, is the UK electricity generation feasibly capable of taking on the demand of the current gas sector? What are the benefits of having a centralised, less diverse energy supply? I think you've all touched on this within your reflections and your presentation. It kind of underpins the crux of the question here as well. But I thought I'd throw that out to you because that is the most popular question still.
I mean, I think it is feasibly capable, definitely. There are challenges. I think there are engineering challenges. We talked about these kind of challenges around the sort of regulatory and commercial structures. Just trying to understand, get underneath Finn's question a bit of having a centralised, less diverse. So I suppose maybe kind of spatially diverse, I guess, is maybe part of it. I mean, we've been through a loop, actually. We used to have lots of distributed energy, small scale generators spread across the country. We did manage to operate the system pretty reliably, back, first half of the 20th century. The kind of bulking up, the exploitation of economies of scale happened through the 1960s, 70s and 80s. Large scale power stations that were kind of more visible, easier to see. We haven't really kind of realized the need, I think, to keep track of the small scale generation. It's a real problem with kind of monitoring what's there right now. We have a peak electricity demand in Britain of typically about 60 gigawatts. We've got, I think the last count, one of my PhD students, Sam, looked into it a little while ago, 37 gigawatts of small scale distributed generation. Only a small part, very small part of that is monitored. So, when we had this disturbance last year, the network companies couldn't say with confidence how much of it had tripped. So if we're going to run this system in the future in a stable way, that's got to change. They should have been putting in the monitoring as they were being connected. It gives you the opportunity then to control things in a particular way. We've got, market mechanisms of a sort that have allowed the system to be operated, ancillary services. Now they need to be reformed, I think, and kind of updated, but there is a kind of a platform that's there, and I think we can do it. We should be able to do it with, modern communications and IT, but we're a long way from doing it, I think, right now.
I mean, Keith, just coming in, this is perhaps a kind of question to you as well. So I mean, that's really alluding to the fact that, if we get rid of gas, we're going to lose coal. So we get that gap, and at the moment, all we've got that's going to fill it is increased amounts of generation from nuclear, and then significantly increased output from renewables. But neither of those helps you do the kind of supply demand balancing bit. So we touched on hydrogen to an extent, but the other big one is obviously just sort of very large scale storage. So what are the options that we've got to use large scale storage or implement large scale storage and help us meet that supply demand match?
I think the analysis that the CCC had commissioned, for example, for the net zero report that came out last year, seemed to think that actually it was hydrogen that provides that large scale storage, the ability to have a base load manufacture of hydrogen from methane reformation with CCS, and then some sort of flexible electrolysis topping up on that. The scale of that depending largely on the extent to which the cost of electrolyzers comes down. But that ability to store hydrogen and then to use it back in the electricity system. I mean, Siemens tell us that they're on the point of having a commercially viable large-scale combined cycle gas turbine that burns hydrogen. So that seems to be, well, it seems feasible. Whether it's the lowest cost way of doing it, I'm not totally sure, because there is this question of how much of it do you need, to kind of reach a certain level of probability of meeting everyone's needs. There's a short-term flexibility from the demand side, of course, and that helps an awful lot, but it doesn't help so much if you're looking at these wind droughts of periods of days. And the other bit is interconnection, which I kind of touched on. But so we make use of that, and the modelling that we've done out to kind of 2030 and 2040 suggests that that's going to be really important. Of a kind of, we've got a 2030 scenario with a negative residual demand of 12 gigawatts in one of our scenarios, but we can spill that 12 gigawatts to our neighbours. But it depends on them being able to use it. If that's happening at the same time as they've got a surplus, that's not so good. But then if you have a bigger area, then you've got to, potentially, I mean, people have talked about a global grid, which seems a bit mad. But, people in different time zones, the time of use, so you've already got some diversity built in there. So there are options. For me, the challenge is what's the right mix of all these things, and what the commercial levers will be to kind of get them in place by the time you need them.
I mean, just to sort of hog the conversation a wee bit. I mean, if you're talking about hydrogen as a kind of large-scale energy storage solution, so you're going from generation of the hydrogen, so you get an electrolyzer, you're then storing it, and you're then pushing it through CCGT or a big fuel cell or something. That's a round-trip efficiency of what, 25%. So the poorer that storage efficiency is, the more generation you've got to build to meet that demand drought. So, or that wind power drought. So it's.
Yeah, it's a good point about the round-trip efficiency of it, and that opens up opportunities, possibly for other forms of medium to long-term storage. How efficient are they in comparison? Sorry, I'll let Becky do come in.
Sorry. So I just wanted to come in and extend this discussion from beyond just the kind of operational aspects and thinking about efficiency in operation to thinking about kind of whole of life, because obviously the decision to embed different types of storage in the grid will have implications way outside of the UK. So even if you're talking about that from a UK centric perspective, the implications extend way beyond. So where are those resources coming from? What are the environmental and social and financial implications on the kind of countries where we're resourcing those materials? And I kind of think when we're thinking about decision making, we focus a lot on the operational aspects, but perhaps if we're talking here about sustainable development and in a global context, we need to take that end-to-end perspective when we're making decisions.
Yeah, I think you're totally right. And obviously we can think about, where we're getting lithium from for batteries. I mean, I think as a grid storage medium, batteries have a niche, but I think it's a niche, but, we've got more potential from batteries on wheels. People seem to value kilometers more than kilowatt hours. So, if we do have EVs being used in the same way as in combustion engine vehicles now, they're going to have a lot of time being parked, and that's almost free storage because people have wanted to buy the batteries for the kilometers that they give anyway. But still a big demand for the materials that go in there. So I don't know. I mean, we need some electrochemists to help us out on what the alternative materials are. I know there's a lot of work going on that. But you're right. We have to see this in the context of where all these materials are coming from.
So that brilliantly links into the second top question, which is asking around and aligning this discussion with future energy scenarios. The press specifically mentions the document by Ofgem. But actually, I'm going to take that and broaden the question and link it up to some of the other questions that are coming in actually around geographic variations and decision-making and planning in these kind of long-term goals. So clumping all of that together, sorry everyone, I'm probably bashing up your questions, but clumping that all together and reinterpreting it, I wonder if there's a question that the panel would like to answer around what is the current level of knowledge of decision-making powers that bring in these various different aspects that we're talking about, whether it's from sustainable resourcing of materials that go into electric batteries, through to the citing that's given here by Josephine, a citing of infrastructure where there's not actually the transmission infrastructure to support it, and so on. So what is the state of play at the moment, and how do we solve some of these challenges to make an optimal low carbon future?
I'm conscious I've talked a lot in this webinar, but I'll kick it off and let others come in. But I mean, the way we've been doing that decision making over the last, certainly over the last sort of 30 years has been through price signals. The assumption has been that the market will, reveal the cost of different things and give us an opportunity to choose whoever it is that's in a position. So, for example, where are we going to build a wind farm, or where are we going to build a gas turbine plant on the supply side will be, in theory, driven by a price that is quoted to have a grid connection, and that price will be different according to the location. And in theory, that price reflects what it would really cost to get that grid connection there. So if you've got a choice and you could build your wind farm there or there, in principle, and all other things being equal, you will go to the place where the infrastructure implications are lower, where it's cheaper. Okay, that all sounds very well in theory, but to me it then depends on, well, how well is that price signal articulated? Does it really reflect, as Becky was talking about, the long-term, kind of whole cost? And whoever's making the decision, can they make sense of the signals that are there? Because it's not just a signal for now. They have to be, those signals may be changing over time. So can you make a forecast, for example, of what the electricity price will be, or what the gas price will be, or whatever? So the presence of uncertainty makes it a really difficult challenge. Does that then mean we have to come back to some kind of more centralized decision making that, if you like, socializes the risk? So, which means we all pick it up maybe as taxpayers, which is kind of the model that was used, through, certainly in this country, since the sort of 1920s, I suppose, or I can't remember when the electricity industry was was nationalized, but certainly through that nationalized time, knowing there were uncertainties about the price of coal or nuclear technology, price of oil, the risks associated with going for a particular strategy were kind of shared among all of us. I don't know. I mean, should we go down that route again, or is there something in the middle? I don't know. No one was jumping in on that. Oh, Becky, good.
I will. I think, yeah, the end of that bamboozled me a little bit, but I definitely think that, you know, we're talking about cost, and obviously it's a no-brainer that carbon needs to be better valued in these decision-making frameworks across kind of all scales, whoever's making that decision. But I think something that I've seen, certainly when you start to look at household level decision, is that if you're analysing it from a cost minimisation perspective, the answers you get sometimes just don't make sense. So certainly when you look at things like uptake of some of these new technologies, cost minimization is not the thing that's driving it. And so while from a kind of, if you're looking from a very centralized investment perspective, that might be something that you're looking at, as these decisions start to become increasingly devolved, as we start to have more and more actors and smaller actors participating in the system, then it might not be all about cost minimization, and it might also not be about carbon minimization. I have a colleague that works at the intersection of energy and environment, and she often gives me examples around how, if you're looking to site, say, a new solar farm, that you might want to think beyond just where the cheapest place to bring it onto the grid could be, to also look at what other environmental benefits you could deliver by putting it into other places. This now raises huge questions around, how do you get that data? How do you integrate that data into your decision-making frameworks? Because data around environmental conditions and the environmental impacts might be completely sort of different, and in different structures and so on, and not interoperable with the data that you're using traditionally to base decisions on. So I think taking this whole system perspective, looking at these kind of multiple different outcomes, starts to open a bit of a can of worms for this sort of information that you actually need to be able to make these decisions to tick off a whole number of different outcome requirements.
Great.
Just a small comment on the energy access point of view then as well, is that you know, that the kind of the decisions between where things are located and then, you know, the infrastructure that might be required later is a really important point, because a lot of the modelling that gets done is, you know, on the kind of least cost of providing a kind of a certain level of energy access, if you say national models, and the resources that are available. And, you know, the World Bank, Strathclyde has also done a wee bit of work in this area too, or on, you know, where is it better to extend the grid, or is it better to deploy a solar microgrid, or is it, you know, should you put in a hydro mini grid, or are all of these things be too expensive, and perhaps focus on lower tier solutions, solar home systems? But then what happens next is a big question as the demand grows, and how do those assets, or how do you avoid those assets being stranded in wasted investments? Again, that goes back to the, you know, reducing uncertainty to unleash the investment in the first place. So having those longer term plans about how the assets might grow and interconnection might happen is really important.
Brilliant. Thank you, Damien. And thank you, panellists. There was one final question I hope to get to, which is around geographic variables based on affluence, raised by Connie, rural versus urban challenges raised by Roddy and Paul, and asking about, you know, is there a chance that certain areas will be striving ahead whilst others might be left behind, and can we talk about that? But we have no time. So for another occasion. Thank you massively to our attendees for participating and for your questions and discussion points. Any questions that haven't been answered, we will be answering your questions directly following the webinar. We have 2 minutes to close out, and there's been so many interesting questions and reflections. Before we close, I would like to do 2 things. I'd like to offer our panelists a chance to give a very short sentence reflection on the panel today and the discussions that have been raised, and any final points as well, but extremely short. And as I do so, I am going to launch the final poll, poll 3, that should be live now. This is to hear from you, the audience, what you think about the question we've been discussing today. Can we meet people's needs for energy without unabated burning of fossil fuels? I'll close that in about 20 seconds. Meanwhile, I'd like to just invite, I'll go in the order of Damien, Nick, Rebecca. So Damien, very short snippet, please.
Okay, so thinking about energy access and those that don't have energy access, and can we meet energy demand as they come online without unabated burning of fossil fuels? Yes, I think it is possible, but there will be a huge reliance on decentralised renewables and local energy systems. So for policymakers with immediate challenges to lift large populations out of poverty, then we need to do a lot of work to build the confidence in those kind of systems and unlock investment.
Brilliant. Nick?
I mean, I guess the answer to Keith's question that he posed at the start of this webinar is yes. Yeah, of course we could decarbonise our energy supplies, but if we put the rider to that, can you do it in 20, 30 years? That's where the problems all start to rise. So, have you got the physical time to do it? Is the capital available to do it? Do you have the resources and manpower available to do it as well? That's where we start to get to the problem. And just one other theme that seems to have come out of the discussion is the data available there to actually allow you to make the right decision. So that goes from the householder deciding, well, do I invest in a heat pump, or do I just go for direct electric and insulate my house, right up to this sort of national level with regards to, well, do we go for hydrogen storage, or do we invest in some other technology as well? So data availability and using data to guide our decisions is a really important point I think we need to take from this as well.
Becky?
So I think the question is, can we? I want to say, should we, if it means doing it at the expense of massive, wide-scale environmental degradation, or if it creates huge injustices within society. So not to say that we shouldn't be doing it, but I think that we need to be thinking about this in line with some of the wider objectives reflected by the broader set of Sustainable Development Goals.
So maybe the point there is, I think we have to, meet people's needs for energy without burning of fossil fuels. But maybe the point is, and there are options for how we do it, and we've got to be really mindful of the whole set of impacts of different options. And the challenge then, and we're picking up something that Nick said as well, have we got the information that can allow us to make kind of good decisions in terms of adopting those different options? And we've got some information, but it's kind of patchy. And I think one of the things we've kind of highlighted, I think, in this webinar is the need. Well, lots of questions need to be answered. The need for work to address them. So for us as researchers, it's fantastic to have the opportunity to work in this. So if anyone out there has got the funding for research to kind of help address some of these questions, then you know where to come.
Thank you very much. And actually, everyone should be able to see the results as well. So we have 84% of you agree that we can meet people's needs for energy without unabated burning of fossil fuels. So I do need to close really quite quickly now. It's time to close out the event, turn off the power, as it were. Thank you very much to our panellists and to all of you for engaging on this sustainability challenge. The webinar recording will be available on the Centre for Sustainable Development website in forthcoming days. And I hope that many of you will be joining the other webinars in this series celebrating the launch of the University of Strathclyde's Centre for Sustainable Development. It's been great engaging with you, and I'll see you all at these forthcoming events.